Been the conversation since Monday. We had almost 20 presidents coming into the country. In studio, we have Joseph Ibrahim, who is a climate activist from West Africa, from Nigeria. First of all, I must ask, how are you finding Kenya so far?
Really lovely city. Happy, see a lot of people moving on the street. People have been welcoming, so yeah, it has been a really exciting experience so far.
The last 3 days has been a bed of activities. We've had presidents coming in. We've had a lot of regulations and policies that have been discussed. What would you say were your highlights for the past 3 days?
First, my biggest highlight is to congratulate Kenya for convening this inaugural African Climate Summit. And I think it has largely achieved what it set itself out to achieve. So my biggest highlight basically has been the commitment. I know that so far, investment and proclamations of over $23 billion have been made, and that is significant for Africa. And I think that funds or finance, if realized, will help Africa to adapt to the really catastrophic climate change impact that is ravaging our continent. Yeah.
Now, let's just look at a short clip of the president when this particular summit was starting on Monday.
A future where Africa finally steps into the stage as an economic and industrial power, an effective and positive actor on a global arena.
So what the private sector is doing is to provide the frameworks of their experiences in accessing global finance.
Accessing global finance is, a tentative matter that has been coming up. That was the president of Kenya, Dr. William Ruto, who was speaking about some of the things or benefits that we could accrue from this summit. We also had the CEO of Equity Bank, Dr. James Mwangi, who was talking about private sector and how these benefits can trickle down to businesses in Kenya. Going green, what does this mean for businesses in Africa?
Going green basically is about production in a way that doesn't endanger the environment. It's about producing food, goods, and services that people use in a sustainable manner. Is production generally without producing carbon, and we are hoping that, as it has been said throughout the conference, that Africa is hoping that we'll have a carbon credit market, and this is simply saying that we need to place a price on carbon, and then people or companies or countries who are responsible for emitting large amount of carbon pay the fine, and while countries who sequester carbon get some funds. And that is where I think is the critical part that Africa, solutions that Africa plays in this conversation. Just
to cut you, to ask your question actually, $100 billion is what the president is asking for, not only for Kenya, but for the entire continent. $100 billion could do a lot for Kenya, for Africa. $25 billion has already been committed by the Africa Development Bank. Now, if we just break down these numbers, this amount of money per year from the global north could mean a lot for the African people. Yeah. Maybe if we could just get, if you could just get some of your, what is it called? If we could just get some of your views on this particular commitment, and maybe even talk about how emissions from other countries has affected businesses not only in Nigeria, in Kenya, in all of the African countries, and how airports, not only in Kenya, are coming for carbon credit, or they're coming for to achieve carbon neutralities. These airports have been asked that they could trade in carbon credit. Yeah. This business, what does it mean exactly for Africa?
Okay, so the $100 billion annually is basically the adaptation funds that the Global North has committed. Realistically, this fund is not for only African countries. I know that what they call them, the coastal countries as well are included. But basically, this will help Africa to adapt, particularly in terms of agriculture, that drought is ravaging our food systems,
yes,
and particularly also helping flood-prone areas to be able to build climate smart infrastructure, climate resilient infrastructure that will help them to cope with the impact of climate change as well. So it is a welcome development, but all this while it has always been talk.
Right.
We are already preparing for COP28.
Right.
So it means that we've had this conversation 28 times or more. So we are hoping that this, first and foremost, with the African Climate Summit, is not just talk. We need to act fast, and we need to act in time, because actually we do not have so much time. If we have been talking 28 years ago,
right.
So now we don't have luxury of time. We need to act really fast, and I'm hoping that this is some of the things that, as Africa as a continent prepares to go for COP28, that all the deliberations and all the pledges that the Global North has made in this summit,
yes,
will be realized at COP28 in Dubai. And so my call is just basically no more talk, let's move to action, and let's all act in time.
Right. The financial infrastructure in the globe tends to lean a little bit away from the global south, and it favors the global north, so to speak. When it comes to carbon credit trade also, you will find that Africa is losing out and we're actually underselling. What are maybe some of the items that you would suggest in changing the financial structure in the globe that could help Kenya in this front, or Africa in this front?
I think basically the conversation has not really favored Africa. In all the calculation and metrics, financial metrics globally, they do not account for Africa's abundant natural resources. A typical example is the Congo rainforest, which is one of the largest rainforests in the world. This rainforest sequesters carbon for the entire world and help us maintain equilibrium in the environment.
Right.
But you can be sure that Congo is not receiving a penny for that. So if the global carbon market is calibrated appropriately, countries like Congo and many other African countries who have large forest reserves will receive carbon credit for helping the world to breathe well and sustainably. And that finance can be converted to help communities who are already grappling with the impacts of climate change. It will help in climate smart agriculture, it will help in climate resilient infrastructure as well. And generally it will also help in producing and establishing green enterprises that will promote green skills and create green jobs as well. So the opportunities are enormous, and we are hoping that, like I said earlier, no more talk, let's move to action.
You had spoken about smart infrastructure, or green infrastructure, and how a lot of African countries should be collaborating to ensure that we actually achieve this in the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which has been spoken about at length as well. They had talked about collaborating on this particular front. Infrastructure in Africa, the actualization is what, less than almost even 20% actualizing this infrastructure. Do you think that this maybe is a good thing, because maybe we're presenting a clean slate of collaboration?
Yeah, thank you very much for mentioning that. One of the narratives have always been, oh, Africa needs money from the global north, and if they don't give us those money, we will not be able to do anything. I'll give you a typical example. In Nigeria, when we privatized the telecommunications industry, and we needed the global north in quote to invest. Many of them refused to invest in that sector. It took a South African company, MTN, to invest, and right now they are one of the biggest stakeholders in that company. So what we need right now is we need Africans supporting African businesses. We need the private sector in Africa to drive the green enterprises across Africa. Once we drive green enterprises in Africa, we'll produce green jobs, and we ensure that generally our environment is more secured. And then we can now earn carbon credit, and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement gives us that leverage, helps us to be able to do business with different countries. And so we don't have to wait for the world to price carbon. We can start at the continental level using the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and we use that as an avenue to promote green businesses. And yeah, we move on from there.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that, Joseph, because African countries or a lot of Kenyan businesses were complaining that the compliance markets are not in favor of African businesses, and we're not making as much from carbon credit trade, which is still a thing that needs to be demystified, you know, in and of itself. They're not making as much. We are talking about Kenyan or African businesses making about $10, while, you know, from businesses from the global north are making over $50. Yeah. Could we have our own regulation system? Could we have our own systems that can help us trade better? Absolutely, and I think that is the best way for us to go. We need to encourage ourselves, and then we need to move faster. Our population, we have a huge population on the continent. The numbers, I don't have the exact number, but I know 1.3 billion.
1.3 billion. Yes. So you have, that is market. Yes. Ready market for business, and we need to engage those numbers. I know that many of the global north, when they see Africa, the only thing they think of is market. So it is time for Africans to also see ourselves as the biggest market in the world. One of the very recurring narrative throughout the summit has been the median age of Africa, which is 19 to 19.3. So we have a very youthful population. And the youth are known to have the capacity to drive innovation, to drive technology. And so we need to leverage all of these advantages and potentials that we have to ensure that we drive a new future, a new generation of green businesses, a new generation of green enterprises across the African continent. And then we break all the bottlenecks and barriers regarding trade between our countries. I think that's also the biggest challenge. I know that there are travel border restrictions across country. I needed a visa to come here, and all of that. We need to find a way to restrict and remove all the bottlenecks, and that would resist us from doing business with each other. And I think that's the best way for us to proceed. And maybe even, Joseph, you know, a huge argument was stemming from the fact that a lot of countries in the global north have advanced due to industrialization. Now that they've reached the peak, they're trying to enforce, you know, all these restrictions. You know, we need climate action. And a lot of African countries and businesses and organizations were saying, can we come to the same level, and then we can start talking about going green? What's your take on this? So basically what you've just asked me is what we have been saying, which is climate justice. Yes. The whole conversation is injustice. You have developed, and at the point where Africa is saying, okay, we need to develop, you are saying, no, don't use fossil fuel. And so far, Africa has largely agreed, okay, we will not use fossil fuel, but then you have to help us. But then if the help is not forthcoming, so the whole conversation, you're saying, okay, no fossil fuel investment in Africa, but then you are not also investing in Africans. So that is injustice for us, and that is some of the things that we do as activists to say that we need climate justice. And climate justice is those who are responsible for causing these issues need to pay for it. They need to be more accountable to their actions and where they have brought the world to, and that's what we need. And that will start first by pricing carbon. When we price carbon, and they pay for it and give us the credit, our natural resources. And I must add this, that the revolution or green revolution is likely going to be ruled by batteries And the resources for those batteries, over 40% of those reserves globally are in Africa. So we need to receive and be able to earn money for those natural resources that we have. They should no longer remain assets on the ground. They should also be assets that we can cash out from.
Tangible assets.
Yeah, tangible assets, yeah.
Of course. Joseph, you've talked about accountability, which is a very interesting topic in and of itself. $100 billion has been committed, but it had been committed, but it had not been actualized.
Yeah.
And the presidents came together and they were like, where is the $100 billion? Do you therefore think that now we've had our own summit, the very first of its kind, do you think that it will be easier now to get that $100 billion in funding?
Yeah, I think this is a very good step. It gives us room to call for a family meeting.
Right.
And when you call for a family meeting before you go out to deliberate, there's that chances that you are more united. Right. And with unity, you get what you want faster. So I think that's why I will congratulate the President of the Republic of Kenya for convening this summit. I think this goes a long way. And most importantly, some connections. We know that many of the decisions at COP are usually taken before COP.
Right.
They just go there to finalize.
And to announce.
Yes, and to announce. So this is a good starting point. We have about 2 months to 3 months before COP. I believe that many of the connections, many of the contacts and networks that have been established at this summit will be very crucial at COP. We had the COP president who was here,
yes,
who also announced $4.5 billion in finance for clean energy in Africa. And so we already have tangible things to pursue.
Right.
Unlike other COPs that will just go and we're like, okay, we want climate adaptation funds. Now we have some tangibles, commitment, that pledges that people have made, that we are going to COP to say, you made these pledges, you made this commitment at the African Climate Summit. It is time that you you redeem your pledges at COP28.
Right, and speaking with one voice, we've called a family meeting, we've come up with all of these things that we want to be worked on, and maybe now we can have them actualized in a more serious manner. That takes us for the very first break on the marketplace. When we come back, we will be talking about the natural resources in Africa and how businesses can either tap into this or work with this so that they can make the most out of climate action. We go for a short break. We'll be right back.
Going to town, not another continent!
For that price, we'd rather walk.
It's a rip-off! Our flight was cheaper.
Seriously, don't you have a heart?
That thing? Of course it doesn't. Rather deal with real people. Download InDrive, agree on a fair price with your driver, and say goodbye to unfair rides. InDrive, people driven.
Hi, hi!
At the East Africa University, we understand that there are limitless possibilities for brilliant minds. Join us for our September intake for short courses, certificate courses, diploma courses, degree courses, and Master of Business Administration. For more information, you can contact us on 0722 545167. Email us on marketingdepartment@teau.ac.ke or visit our website at www.teau.co.ke to find out more about our programs and how to apply. The East African University, the wellspring of knowledge and character.
Radio 47, tuko nawe mchana kutwa na usiku kucha. 101.8 Garissa. Tunavuma na bado.
Welcome back to the Marketplace, and tonight we're talking about financing climate action. We are with Joseph Ibrahim, a climate activist, and we're just talking about how over 70% of Africa's population are farmers, and we're seeing that 30 to 50% of African resources is from natural wealth. Our GDP is largely based on getting natural wealth. Do you feel like farmers were addressed, or the needs of farmers were addressed in this particular summit?
So I think one of the first, even as civil society organization, that was one of the first demands that we had for this summit, that largely we didn't want the summit to be a summit that focuses on the general rhetoric about climate change. We wanted this summit to focus basically on Africa's adaptation needs. And in doing that, the top of it is farmers in Africa, because largely we are an agrarian continent. Right. A lot of our people are farmers, and equally we depend on rainfall largely for cultivation. And with increased drought all across the continent, it makes it difficult for people to produce food. And so that is a conversation that needs to happen. And when we talk about adaptation in Africa, basically we are talking about food production. Mm-hmm. And I think that largely from the declaration of the African Development Bank, mm-hmm. and they had the 25 billion, which we also mentioned earlier, a large chunk of that would address farm systems, and there are also a lot of interventions around irrigation farming, mm-hmm. and also coming up with flood resilient crops and seedlings, drought resilient seedlings as well, so that farmers would be able to produce food irrespective of the longer drought that they are facing at the moment. Right. And all of this requires finances. And that was why the highlight of the summit was on finance, mm-hmm. Because you need finance for research. We need more research, actually, in some of our indigenous fruits. You will discover that one of the greatest challenges that Africa is facing in terms of food sovereignty, mm-hmm. is the fact that many of our farmers are beginning to depend on seed companies globally, right. to farm annually, and that is not good. Traditionally, Africans have seedlings, mm-hmm. that they keep in their homes, prepare for the next farming season, but these days you go to the market to buy seeds, and these seed companies are not resident here in Africa. Right. So I think that is also a conversation. I don't think that was really highlighted at the summit, right. but it's really, really important that we look into that, the seedlings that we have, because it is a serious problem. If, for instance, you have maybe bilateral disagreement with some foreign companies, like we saw mm-hmm. with Russia and Ukraine, where they say, okay, they are not selling seed for food, for food production to the African continent. Mm-hmm. Where then do we go? So these are critical things that we also look at. The food sovereignty of Africa is a conversation that we need to have, and we need a lot of research, finance to research the way we can preserve and also proliferate seedlings across the African continent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Talking of food sovereignty, as you've so aptly put it, 65% of Africa is made up of arable land that is not being used, to the maximum. You feel like agri-tech should be one of, the sectors that this funding should go to. Was there maybe, when you were there during the summit, was there a conversation on how this particular chunk of 100 billion is going to be broken down?
No. So, Africa has about 54 countries, right. and like I said earlier, the 100 billion is not meant for Africa alone. You have countries in the coastal regions as well that would benefit from that. So that is why I would say that the conversation has always been talk, because we have not moved to real action. Right. So moving to real action, we would categorically say, okay, out of this 100 billion, we want so and so amount to address the agricultural issues in countries that are facing these issues. So amount will address flood-prone communities and flood resilient infrastructure as well. So amount and that conversation I don't think has happened yet, and I'm hoping that these are the conversations we will be having at COP28 because they say when you don't have a plan, and then you plan to fail. So at the moment, the 100 billion doesn't have a plan, and that's why it has failed all these years. So I think it's time we move to action, and that action would first begin, like you have said, a plan on how much we go to each of these sectors and what countries need to do to access these funds. And I think that point is very important because these finances, when they come, they usually come with some very stringent conditions.
Yes.
And sometimes African countries are not able to access them, probably because due to issues of data and the like. So it is important that we look at those issues, those barriers that would hinder African countries from accessing these funds, and see how we can debottle those bottlenecks, and so that people can access these funds and let our communities begin to live a very climate resilient life.
As you know, I'm seeing here you are the West African coordinator of the Climate Clock. Time is ticking. How much time do we have really?
We have about 5 years, 320 days, some few hours, and the seconds are counting down.
Okay.
And we have this time to prevent the irreversible consequences of climate change, and so we don't have so much time. When we started this conversation about climate change, I think it was the Rio Convention in 1992, there was so much time then. Right now, we have less than 5 years to act, so I'm calling on everyone, individuals, civil society organizations, and most importantly, the people who have the power to make change, which are the political leaders, to act, and they should act in time because we do not have time.
On the financial structure, the global financial structure and architecture, we've discovered that, Africa is really missing out, especially when it comes to loaning. You've spoken about how, yes, we'll get the funding, but there are so many stringent measures that we cannot really make the most out of this funding. The President, William Ruto, was speaking about how Africans must come to the table as well when these financial structures are going to be made. Now, do you think that it's plausible, therefore, that we will have an avenue where the globe is going to come together and then we're going to restructure the financial systems?
That is the first step to real action. And because I know even when they make those commitments and maybe, for instance, we are giving this fund, and they push it to probably the global adaptation funds, there would be some stringent measures to get access those funds. I would state that it is something that is needful and it needs to happen really quickly. There was the African Youth Assembly that happened before the African Climate Week. The African Youth Assembly happened from the 1st to 3rd of September, and one of the key demands and declaration of the youth was the establishment of a global green bank. And so these finances, because generally to access finance, we've already talked about Africa being a youthful continent, and we need youth to drive this action. But the problem of youth accessing funds have always been, the banks will tell you, do you have collateral? And as a young person, you probably do not have any collateral. But you have ideas that can change the world. You have innovation and that would impact on people's life positively. But because you do not have collateral, as the bankers will say, you don't have the opportunity to make that change. So some of the demands is that we have a bank that caters for the specific needs of youth, and so that they will have access to finance and funding to drive those ideas and innovations, and that will ensure we have a more sustainable world and lead us to a future that is livable by all.
Joseph, what is the practicality of a green bank without collateral? Kenya was proposing to have a social security system where, they gauge how much of a, upstanding citizen you are, just so to say. And they would use maybe your previous finances, how well you pay debt, so on and so forth. Do you think that we have the capacity to be collecting enough data from the entire continent to have a green bank?
Yeah, we have to start from somewhere. Sometimes you imagine if Bill Gates was African, nobody would have supported his idea too, because they were asking for collateral which he didn't have. And so we need to invest in African youth, and that has been the key word also in this summit. Right. Investment. We don't need empowerment. Empowerment is a cliche. We need to invest in youth, and that investment will yield changes in our communities. I think the greatest risk, like bankers, the reason why they will ask for collateral is they say they try to manage risks. Yeah. But at the moment, the greatest risk for any banker or any African country is not investing in its youth. So we need to invest in our youth. We need to invest in their ideas. We need to invest in the technology and the big ambitions that they have to change the world. And the Green Bank or whatever financial institution that we can come up with will be a starting point. And I don't think, even if it's in form of seed funding, something that you give, you make an investment as a kind of seed funding and see where that is. When they are able to grow the businesses, the green enterprises, then you can give them more funding. So there's some kind of accountability in the whole process. So, but I think it's something that we need to focus on. We cannot keep using the financial systems of the 90s in a world, like someone said, technology is changing really fast. Faster, maybe 10 times faster than the way our curriculums are changing. And if it's 10 times faster than the curriculum, I think it's even 100 times faster than the financial systems globally. So the financial systems need to change as well to suit the times that we are in.
It's very sad that, Kenya and Africa is actually playing catch-up, so to speak, technology-wise, business-wise. And this word, green enterprise, green energy, there's a lot of green being thrown around. For small businesses, especially in Kenya, what does this mean for me? How can I be a green business, so to speak?
Okay, so the whole idea of being green, for anything to be green, maybe your flowers, or the grasses, you know that you have to pay attention to it. It's either you cut it, you trim it, you water it, whatever it is, you have to pay attention to it. Right. So what this is saying is basically whatever business that you are doing, or whatever enterprise or endeavor that you are engaging, you are conscious of the changes that is happening in the environment. So you are conscious that this activity or enterprise that I'm into is not affecting the well-being of the environment. Right. And when we say the well-being of the environment, we are saying that your actions are not, or your businesses are not polluting the air, they are not polluting the waters, they are also not polluting our lands. So when you are sure that in all your business activities or in all your endeavors, you are not damaging water resources, you are not also damaging the land resources, and our air are even better for the work that you are doing, then you have a green business. And that's what we are promoting. We do not want business that at the expense, that a profit at the expense of our environment. And that's just the message globally. Don't do business, don't make money at the expense of the environment. Right. Because the environment does not forgive. Whatever you give it to it, it might take it for a while, and then it gives you back. And when it gives you back, you don't have opportunity to retrace your steps. Right. Usually at that time, it's usually already too late, and the consequences will be on your health, will be on your livelihood, will be on your family and relatives as well. So that is why we promote and say, yeah, we need green businesses. We need to be conscious of what we do and that is not affecting our environment.
Right. One of the ways that, the president was suggesting to encourage businesses to take, the green leap, so to speak, was, to have tax rebates, to incentivize them. And a lot of private sector players were also saying, maybe if we got, cut on your taxes here, maybe if you got a rebate here, maybe if you got, partnerships from, going green, that they would be more encouraged to take this. On a continental scale, do you think maybe we can have policies and regulations that would encourage businesses to go green?
Yeah, and I will once again start by congratulating the people of Kenya who, I think the president signed the Climate Change Act on the 1st of September. And that's a big step, and those are kind of the policies that we need, laws and bills across the continent, and that will fast track some of these things, because even for the pledges that many of these countries and the global north have made to Africa, the instrument in which they will come are largely going to be embedded in policies, national frameworks, and that people have across the continent. So it is something that all the African countries need to do. I know Kenya has done that, and Nigeria has done that as well. So we need those policies. But beyond those policies, we need concrete actions. We do not want countries paying consultants in Europe and America to come up with policies for them, just for the sake of it, to say, oh, so now you said we need a policy, now we have a policy, so give us money. That's not how it will work. I feel people should do this policy, taking cognizance of the various contexts in the different countries that we have. No two countries are the same. Every country has its peculiar challenges, and we need to pay attention to those contexts. And those policies must reflect the context of different nations. And then when we have that, I think we'll be on the right path to attract the right investment, to attract the right technology, and also to attract the right framework that will help us conserve our environment as a whole.
For the Pan-African dream, especially for the youth, knowing that there was a meeting or a summit, a pre-summit for the youth particularly, what were some of the policies, what were some of the points of discussions that you had for this Pan-African dream?
Okay, basically, like I mentioned, one of the first ones was the Green Bank. Across the continent, the youth are doing fantastic work. They are driving innovations and ideas that will change the world. Sadly, many of them are not receiving the required support to upskill those innovations. And so the conversation at the Youth Assembly was, how do you support youth to drive this process? And that was the thing that brought about the Green Bank. But most importantly, the youth are saying, we don't want to be excluded from where decisions are being made. For many people, the campaign has always been, this youth need a seat at the table. But then it was not, at the end of this assembly, the conclusion was that the youth actually do not need a seat at the table. The most important thing at the table is not your seat, it is your voice. And so the youth are saying, yeah, we want to be at the table, but then we don't just want to be watchers, where we sit at the table and then people make decisions on our behalf. We want our voice to be heard, and we want to also make our decisions that will affect our life directly. And those were the key things. Both at national level, the youth are saying we want to be involved. At international level, the youth are saying let's get involved. And we will no longer take the back seat in all of this conversation. So, and those were some of the highlights. And I think we are making progress, which we saw, like we saw in this African Climate Summit. We had a large number of youth representation, And in the declaration that was also announced, you can see the input, the voice of the youth was very strong there as well. Yeah.
Any talks on the carbon credit market, the possibilities that African countries can have, considering that the compliance market is shortchanging African countries?
My take on that is basically we cannot continue to wait for the global north. The typical example is your house is on fire. You cannot sit down and do nothing and say because the cause of the fire is your neighbor, then you let your house keep burning. So we can't afford to do that. Our house is already burning. We're already seeing the impact of climate change. So if carbon pricing is a solution, then we need to exploit it. And like we said earlier, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement gives us an opportunity there. We need to come up with a way we'll trade amongst the African nations and ensure that, yes, we are growing businesses, we are creating jobs, which is very important in all of these conversations, because we have large number of youth that are unemployed across the continent, and so we need to explore that. We need to create businesses that will create employment, and all of this presents an opportunity. And most also, I will say that in terms of finance and carbon credit, one of the things that we need to look at as African countries is the debt. Many of the African countries are in debt, so we need to recalibrate our debt, and I don't know how that conversation will go, but the resources that we have, like we've said in the forest in Congo, the natural resources, we need to find a way to trade our debt for those resources, so that when our debt to GDP ratio is quite low, we'll have opportunities to borrow more, and borrowing directly for interventions that will improve the environment and that will improve the livelihoods of communities that are at the front line of these issues. So that is also very important.
And as the youth were, discussing matters that were affecting them, the business community had also come together and they've made an Africa Business Coalition, which they feel like, would be a united front. They wanted to talk about accreditation of businesses in the carbon markets and what possibilities there could be therefore, because they felt like they were not being acknowledged and, they were not being accredited for the steps that they have taken to reduce carbon emissions. Do you think that this united front, especially of businesses, is practical, considering all, the trade embargoes and all the tariffs and all the borders that we have?
Yeah, there is a popular African saying that if you want to walk, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. So unity is a very strong opportunity. So when people always come together, their force is greater than when individuals go. So I think that is a very welcome development. It's something that we'll continue to encourage. The larger, the better. It means their voice will get stronger. The carbon market is still an emerging phenomenon. Even in the carbon market, there are different. There are people who will say cap and trade. There are people who say carbon fee and dividend. You get a fee, then you pay the dividend to communities and all of that. So people, I won't say there is a universal agreement or consensus on what the carbon market should be. And so it's emerging, but if we are able to organize like the businesses, small businesses are doing, it provides opportunity. First, they are being ready for the opportunity that will present itself maybe in the next 2-3 years. Because the truth of the matter, we cannot continue to do business as usual. We cannot afford to do that. So if we are ready, we know that as much as things, we are hoping that in the next 2 to 3 years, there will be very rapid changes in the business models across the world. And for communities and small businesses who are already putting themselves together, they have opportunities to attract funding and to attract skill acquisition and the like, because we know that we are moving to a time where people will not do business with people who don't have some kind of carbon credit.
Right.
Yeah, so if they are ready for that, I think it presents a great opportunity, and I will continue to encourage that.
We cannot keep operating as business, business as usual. That's a very nice way to start concluding this particular conversation. Maybe knowing what we know now and having discussed what we already discussed, especially in the last 3 days of the Africa Climate Summit, what are the highlights or what are the taking points that you're going to be going with to COP28, which I am assuming you will be at?
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you're going to be taking forward?
So basically, first, Africa we need to place priority on that, because for the global north, it's basically about mitigation, about cutting down carbon emissions, and so they are focused more on renewable energies, which is something that we need to do. So, but as the focus is on renewable energy, Africa is a continent of energy poverty. Many of our communities do not have access to energy at all, not to talk of clean energy. So with that, my hope is that as we go to COP28 and many of these people redeem their pledges, that these funds will drive, we move to renewable energies as well. Will be focused on providing energy access to communities and the society generally in Africa. And I would not also leave out the fact that we need a lot of investment in education as well. We need to invest in education of our young girls and children and the youth, and to be ready to take up those green jobs and also to drive those green enterprises that we need across the continent. So basically, from all the talk that have happened here, I want that as we go to COP28, I will see actions, concrete actions with timelines of when they will be achieved, and with regulatory frameworks that will keep people accountable for their actions and pledges and commitment as well.
And the youth should be keeping people, they must make sure that these pledges are achieved. That is Joseph Ibrahim, a climate activist and also the West African coordinator for the Climate Clock. Time is ticking. You've said 5 years?
Yeah,
we have 5 years.
Less than 5 years.
Less than 5 years.
Yeah. With
running seconds even. Thank you so much for joining us tonight on The Marketplace. We have had such a, in-depth conversation on climate action, the funding of climate action, and some of the highlights and key points that were discussed during the last 3 days, where almost 20 presidents